Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6, Episode 10, presented by Market Dial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, breaking news. We interrupt our regularly scheduled show for a special solo episode right for the time, ripped from the headlines, faster than a Russian jet spraying a Reaper drone with jet fuel, the banning of TikTok, inspired by the overnight collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. That's right, we're talking about VUCA. Steve, tell the people what's VUCA all about.
Well, VUCA is an acronym. It stands for Volatile, Uncertain, Complex, and Ambiguous. And it is actually I talk about this in my book. It's actually derived from military strategy. But over the years, some folks have come to use it to describe more kind of broadly the business circumstances. And I think it's a good way to describe the world we live in and provide some useful backdrop for taking action.
Yeah, so that we'll have a solo episode. We'll get to talking all about VUCA and its implication. I'm not really going to do a deep dive into the Silicon Valley Bank itself, but more the context of this, how do we adapt in all this, whether it's a global pandemic or all these sudden shocks. All right, well, speaking of inspired, we were inspired to do this episode with recent events. I hope you like that segue. We're off to Shop Talk in Vegas very soon on a big jet plane. We'll be very, very busy. First of all, you're on the stage dropping some knowledge with fellow retail thought leaders. Tell us and tell the people a little bit about who you're with and what you're talking about and when they should block off their calendars if they happen to be one of the thousands attending the show.
Well, I'm batting cleanup. My session is in the last slot of sessions on Wednesday. And we're going to be talking about innovation in retail. And I've got 3 guests joining me. Head of strategy from Tractor Supply Company, head of brand marketing from UGG, and the CEO and founder of a fast-growing sexual wellness brand called Maud. So we're going to be talking about what innovation looks like, what's the difference between sustaining and disruptive kind of innovation, and some particular ways of sorting out what retailers need to do to innovate at the speed of disruption.
Well, there you go. There you have it, folks. If you, for some reason, were bugging out from Shop Talk early, now you've got the reason to change those flights, change those plans, because that sounds like a fantastic session. Now, we're also, we've been working overtime to secure a number of super interesting interviews for the people and for our Shop Talk adventure. Our good friends at Wiseline have come on board as sponsors of our podcast studio. Who's Wiseline? They are a global technology service provider, gives retailers digital superpowers in areas like omnichannel, digital marketing, personalization, cost optimization through automation. So wonderful to have them on board. And it's going to be super fun for us. We're going to be by the beach in Mandalay Bay. That's right. We've got a cabana rented as our podcast studio. So we'll be sipping cocktails and talking retail with some fantastic guests. We're really looking forward to it. All right. Well, let's get into the news. Well, the big story of the news, because we often start with the biggest story, is actually the whole subject of the show. In fact, you and I were talking off mic. We were almost going to jump on last episode and just do an augmentation to the episode in the news. The bank had kind of started to unravel over the weekend, but we thought, hey, let's do a whole episode based on not really Silicon Valley Bank, but it's unraveling in the state of chaos. Now, just for a few of the folks who don't know what SVB is, I really wasn't that familiar with it. Founded in 1983, by December of last year, they held $209 billion in assets, $175 billion in deposits. 44%, I'm throwing out a few facts here that I didn't know, 44% of U.S. venture-backed tech IPOs bank with SVB. 90% of its accounts more than $250,000, which is higher than your typical bank, which means the risk was a bit higher. I guess the government's stepped in. As it turns out. And then I guess they unraveled with the big problem, billions invested in treasury bonds. I mean, again, there's lots of folks talking about this that know way more than me, but basically that's SVB, and I think they were present in a lot of different places, right? Like you knew someone in Dallas that was with the bank, and so you've come across them probably more than once or twice in your career in consulting, yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm on a few advisory boards of tech companies. I'm not necessarily going to disclose which of them bank with SVB, but I also, as I'm around the Texas venture community in particular here in Dallas and occasionally down in Austin, SVB is a pretty constant presence at a lot of events. The woman that runs the area here would frequently be attending. SVB was often one of the lead sponsors of some of these type of events. So, really a key player in the venture ecosystem.
So, anyway, that's probably kind of as much as we're probably going to talk about SVB, but we're going to get to this VUCA concept a bit later in the show. But first, our news. So let's start out with U.S. monthly sales. I guess this is our monthly reminder to everyone that month-over-month sales don't matter. But
eventually we'll be able to stop saying that. But as long as the Wall Street Journal and CNBC and everybody else puts it in the headline, I am on a mission.
If only we knew. If only we knew someone at the Wall Street Journal that we can tap and kind of, once she becomes the editor of the entire paper, that's when I think we might have some luck. But anyway, talk about U.S. monthly sales, what your observations were, and what your thoughts are.
Well, it's a little bit of different day, same story in terms of the patterns we've seen for several months. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Sales were up pretty solidly overall, but pretty much in line with inflation. If you look at the rate of year-over-year change across the last several months, the growth rate's moderating a bit, but not dramatically softer. When you kind of do the deep dive into some of the categories below, there's really unusual strength. I'm not sure I completely understand it in general merchandise stores. So, this would include the discount mass merchants as well as department stores. That was up 10% year over year. And personal care, health and beauty aids, beauty, those sort of things were up 8%. So that definitely seems to be materially above inflation. Clothing, footwear, those sort of businesses up slightly, probably down when you consider inflation. And then again, more of the same in terms of weakness in big ticket kinds of products for the home, furniture, consumer electronics, appliances, and those sort of things. We did get a little bit of news about inflation and the job market. The job market continues to be pretty darn strong, which of course makes people wonder, and we'll get more into, the whole SVB banking sort of stuff in the heart of the episode. But generally speaking, it's pretty clear that while inflation might be moderating a bit, like for example, egg prices, which had been sky high, have started to drop a lot. Gas prices, which have been quite volatile, but they've in general been going down over the last week or so. So there's some pieces of good news with the inflation picture, but still remains quite a bit higher than I think the folks in the Federal Reserve and other banking systems around the world want to see.
Let's talk about some quicker hits with Nordstrom. So they announced some layoffs, which of course is in addition to laying off everyone in Canada, including their stores. But what make of you of Nordstrom statements? Well,
the Nordstrom business, like several other businesses we've touched on, as results have come in, they're not so great. And Nordstrom seems to be making a real effort to get their costs more in line with where their sales seem to be going, which is downward, unfortunately. So they announced about, I think it's 2,500 layoffs. I don't necessarily expect, but given what we're going to talk about in the balance of the episode, who knows at this point, but I don't necessarily expect, massive layoffs across retail, but within the companies that are having a hard time driving the top line, I think we can expect more. So, this is one of the bigger companies that announced a pretty big layoff on top of layoffs that we've seen from Neiman Marcus, from Saks, some of the other players who you would think would be a little bit more insulated from inflation, but apparently the sales outlook continues to be pretty soft.
Well, speaking of that, great segue into layoffs. More layoffs at Meta with their year of efficiency continuing to roll out. Zuckerberg warning economic instability could continue for many years. I mean, I think it sounds like they're rewiring away from the idea of the metaverse and focusing more on AI. And anything else we can make of these layoffs? I mean, they hire a lot of people, right? I mean, they hire, they fire. I mean, that's the industry, right?
I mean, the layoffs, the 2 rounds of layoffs have pretty massive numbers. Part of the analysis I've seen, which we've talked about in the past, just in general about some of these tech layoffs, is so many of these companies went crazy hiring people over the last 2 or 3 years. So even with these layoffs, they're still going to have more people working at Meta than they did a couple years ago. So it's not. I mean, it's obviously difficult for the people affected. I wouldn't say it's really a sign that something's really terrible at Meta.
Now, the story from Europe here, and Europe is front of our minds because, of course, we're heading off to Barcelona for the World Retail Congress, so we've been thinking a lot about Europe. Galeria Kaufhof is one of Europe's largest.
Wunderbar. That was a great pronunciation.
Dunka. One of Europe's largest and oldest department stores has been struggling, not unusual really around the world, and now they're closing 52 of their 129 stores by percentage, huge, and 5,000 job losses. So I guess, the dynamics are, of course, a little different in Europe, but is the story remain the same?
Well, I think this is really more indication of the collapse of the middle. We typically end up talking about that, focused on the U.S. But if you go around the world, whether you're talking about Western Europe or you're talking about, Australia, we've seen a lot of struggles in the department store space. So I think it is just kind of more of the same. It's interesting just having spent some time in the Middle East over the last couple of years. You almost see a tale of two cities or tale of two countries or regions or however you want to look at it, because I think the department store sector overall, gross generalization, is thriving in the Middle East, but just about everywhere else, it's anywhere from extremely challenging to, at best, kind of middling.
Well, let's end on a more positive note, and still in Europe, Canadian superpower in convenience stores, Couche Tard, buys 2,200 gas stations in Europe, and that brings, they've got 14,000 stores, so I guess they'll now have more than 16,000 stores. They tried to buy French grocer Carrefour last year. They're $50 billion. You and I were at NACS in Las Vegas, and maybe we'll put some links in the show notes to some great interviews. The C-store, convenience store category, is just ripe for transformation from, how people drive to how people spend their time. It's a really interesting space, eh?
Yeah, it is. And, here in Dallas, we've got 7-Eleven, which is one of the biggest players, and they've been experimenting with a lot of things. So, yeah, it's a space that, frankly, I'm a customer, but frankly, I haven't paid a ton of attention to, and it really seems to be picking up steam. And I remember when we were going to NACS and you were talking about Couche Tard, and I'm like, what is that word? What are you saying? And and I'm not proud of this, but I had little awareness really of how huge they were and how many different brands they've got and the extent of their operations. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting sector to keep an eye on.
All right, now just before we get to our deeper dive into VUCA and its implications for retailers, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. There are two types of retailers: those that are committed to transforming at the speed of disruption, those that aren't. If you're a retailer that implements significant changes by intuition, you may soon join the Hall of Shame of executives who bet the farm on initiatives that ultimately failed, so, maybe consider brushing up your resume. But if you are a retailer hungry for a better way to gain useful insights on the impact of your store layout, design, and innovation pilots, you need to know MarketDial. MarketDial is an easy-to-use testing platform that emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With MarketDial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. Validate your remarkable ideas with MarketDial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketdial.com. That's marketdial.com. All right, Steve. Well, let's get to the meat of the episode, so to speak, or the large part of our episode where we're talking about living in a VUCA world. And it was all, in one way, it was the idea was spurred by the rapid collapse of SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. But you actually started writing about this even pre-COVID, and of course, we just went through this crazy, unexpected time. It's not done yet, and we continue to have these external shocks. But it's nothing, in some ways, nothing new. You wrote about it pre-COVID. It wasn't like everything was always expected and everything was cool and there was no reason to expect any sudden things. So talk a little bit about that, because, again, you were talking about it pre-COVID. It's probably been accelerated or amplified with our recent events, but it's not new.
No, it's not. I somewhat got interested in it, and I won't go into a big tangent here, but I'll call it a little bit of my kind of spiritual awakening or development, where I started to realize that, I'm not as in control of things in my life as I might like to be, and I often behave. So there was a little bit of just understanding that there's lots of forces in, whether we're talking about business or our personal lives that are really outside of our control, and we need to accept the things we cannot change and focus on the things we can. So that was a little bit of the backdrop, but more specific to my consulting and my speaking and my writing was just noticing the increase in volatility and how hard it was to kind of read the tea leaves or plan for the long term, because things continue to shift so dramatically. And if you look at business models that kind of, we'll talk more about maybe the macro factors, but even thinking about how quickly business models have emerged, whether it's the Warby Parkers of the world or the Ubers or Netflix, or these businesses that either didn't exist 15 years ago or were quite tiny, that are reshaping complete sectors. And now we've got, Shein, Temu, all sorts of other brands. I mean, TikTok, emerged very, very quickly. So this idea of VUCA is really that this is just the way the world operates. And that causes us, and I can talk maybe in a second about kind of how the acronyms lead us to particular courses of action. But yeah, I just started to see the pace of change accelerating, and that it was becoming harder and harder to sort through what was going to happen. And so I reflected that in the first edition of my book. And then when COVID hit, we could call it maybe a black swan event if people are familiar with that term of, something that comes something's hugely unexpected, kind of comes out of left field, ends up having really massive, unanticipated impact. I mean, that to me just said, well, wow, yeah. I mean, this has been true, but if you needed an example to really, really prove it, then COVID's a good example. And then I guess just say, in the case of the SVB news, which is really more this broader, and I kind of hesitate to, say anything too definitive because, by the time this episode comes out or people listen to it, who knows what else will have happened. Yeah. But I didn't have a potential global banking crisis on my bingo card, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. Do you think, perceptually, is it faster moving, more change, more shocks now than 50 years ago, than, 75 years ago? Or is the infrastructure in place that it just spreads faster? I mean, the news spreads faster. I mean, it's not like we haven't had global pandemics. We had one right after the First World War that killed far more people. We've had banks, back to the Great Depression, we had banks collapse before. Is perceptually this a case, or is it a reality that with the systems and technology that these things come and go even faster? How do you think about that?
Well, I definitely believe overall that the pace of change continues to accelerate. You're absolutely right. I mean, we've had world wars, we've had all sorts of
that was a big shock.
Events. I think the main thing or things that are different mostly relate to digital technology and how that has created this vast web of connection. And that web of connection plays out in, if you just want to talk about media, right? I mean, media now has shifted so strongly to digital. Netflix's entire business model basically is about streaming, right? Like technology did not allow for you to prosecute your business in that particular way without this web of connection, without processing speeds massively increasing, without the cost of data coming down, without having people, having such a high penetration of smart devices. So all these things created some of these conditions. Sharing economy models like Uber and Airbnb, right? The digital connection that allows you to connect assets and people, marry this kind of supply and demand in a way that, that just was not possible 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I do think there's some massive changes. And then, of course, what people learn about a new brand, a celebrity influencer, so much of that is also enabled by digital technology, particularly social media, but other things. So I think the digital shifts are the most profound. The macroeconomic things maybe are more similar in their rhythms than some of the technology and consumer preference changes and shifts.
Well, let's talk about the framework itself. So at the beginning of the show, we talked about the words, at least, what VUCA stood for. But take us a little deeper into that. I mean, take us into the kind of, as you see this as a useful framework beyond just the words. But tell us how you see this coming together, and when you do your keynotes, how you advise retailers and other communities how to use this to your advantage and actually, well, I don't know, develop strategy or develop a more agile organization using these principles.
Yeah, there's some overall big takeaways I'll get to in just a couple of minutes, but just to kind of go through the framework in a tiny bit more detail. And yeah, it is interesting. We were talking off mic about how, while, as I mentioned, I did include a section about VUCA towards the end of my book, first edition, and then I included it in the second edition, which came out after COVID had its impact. I have started to add it back in the last year or so to my keynotes because I think it is such an important mindset to have as we're thinking about strategy and in particular as we're thinking about innovation and transformation. So just to go quickly back to the acronym of VUCA. So V is for volatile. And I think everybody probably gets a sense of what that means and just how volatile all sorts of conditions can be. Again, might depend a little bit what industry, what country you're in. Yeah. But obviously, we saw a tremendous amount of volatility through the pandemic. As we're recording this, Wall Street's been pretty volatile. Sure. I'm a little scared to turn on the CNBC when we get done. But what the VUCA framework calls us to think about is really developing our vision much more clearly, to kind of narrow, maybe not dramatically, but narrow our focus. Because if we spread ourselves too thin, if we keep too many possibilities open, then we can really be racked by this volatility. So it's always important to have mission, vision, purpose, those kinds of things. But I think if you buy into this notion that we are in this VUCA world, then you really, really have to get the clarity of vision. Who are you targeting? What benefits, what products and services you're offering in a really unique way, what's going to be the thing that really makes you remarkable to stand out, and so forth. When we think about you, uncertain, again, I think as we sit here, most people probably feel like the future in many respects is pretty uncertain. What the VUCA framework suggests is that we really focus on getting a deeper understanding. So the way I think about this anyway is, do we understand our customers well enough? Do we know what it's going to take to acquire more customers, grow them, retain them, get high NPS scores, whatever that might look for you? Do we understand really as well as we need to what the competition is doing? Do we understand which technologies or which macro forces, some of these more external things, do we really understand them? Do we have the awareness we need? Do we accept the reality that we're facing right now and might face in the future to take the actions we must?
Is there room in the uncertainty part? I mean, it feels like a daunting task to try to understand everything that's going on. Like, is it a spectrum? I mean, a fulsome understanding of so many issues that are changing so fast that are actually really, really complex. How do you think about that? Like, when you go to develop understanding, no matter what sector you're in, you may not achieve the zen of really understanding what the heck's going on, but can you get close? And is the work on understanding almost enough to get you close to where you need to be?
Well, I think it's a great question. There's only so much time. There's only so much money. Right. You've got to be able to set some priorities. I would argue in general, and in fact, I was just working on this section on the book that I'm working on, which is about, one of the things it's about is how I believe many companies that are struggling did not do the work, did not dig deep enough, did not open the aperture enough to understand what was really going on, that they kind of approached their situation as amateurs, not professionals, to borrow from our friend Stephen Pressfield's language. Yeah. And so, yes, you cannot do everything. And even with understanding, you cannot change anything. But to approach things with more of a beginner's mind, to not be so locked into preconceived notions, habits, assumptions, things like that. By the way, on this topic, I would recommend Adam Grant's book, Think Again, which is terrific on this subject. But
you're
so
talking
you
about
have to make some
you're talking
choices.
about humility, right? I mean, basically be humble enough to understand how complex it is, and this beginner's mindset, as you and Pressfield really talk about.
Yeah, well, there's the humility, I think, going in that you might be wrong, that what got you here may not get you to where you need to go. I mean, there's absolutely that part and the beginner's mind kind of part. But then there's, just doing the work, waking up to the other possibilities. And then you have to figure out, and again, you make the point, I mean, you can't do everything. So you have to somehow decide what you think is important, but you also have to be willing to kind of change that along the way. But I would say that we are in a world where if you're going to transform for the future, you're going to have to dig deeper and understand things perhaps at a level, and then think through their implications, maybe run scenarios. I mean, there's a lot of different ways this could spool out. Right.
All right, let's get to C, from complexity to clarity. Clarity is not the easiest thing to get to some days, but again, it's in the work. Yeah.
I like this framework, and I think in most cases, most people would agree that the world has gotten much more complex, whether we're talking about customer behavior or supply chains or whatever it might be, integrating technology. I mean, it's all incredibly complex. And, hopefully if you spend the time on developing that understanding, you'll have the foundation to be able to deal with this complexity. But the C that marries up to it, as you mentioned, is clarity. And, it's a little bit of the, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I think about this as intensifying your focus. So that may be narrowing down the customers that you're focused on, not trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody, because then I think it's very hard to understand where you're resonating. Doesn't have to get super narrow. But I think, for example, if some of the brands we've talked about, RH transformed its business over a number of years by really getting this much more narrow focus on which customers it wanted to serve, and then serving more of their needs in a more profound way. Tractor Supply's had a lot of success by not trying to be, a pet supply player or a home improvement player in the traditional sense, but having a focus on their sort of customers, including with a strong geographic focus. So I think there's a lot of ways to accomplish this. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but getting that clarity of customer product market fit, those kinds of things, I think are the way you work through this.
Well, I'm glad you brought up some retailers, because as we think about these, there's certainly best in class and less than best in class examples. But you mentioned RH. Are there any others? As you were saying that, I was reflecting back on all the many great interviews we've done, and it is a bit of a hallmark. I think, for example, talking to Satish from the Container Store about how we found a growth opportunity by being focused and better, and a little bit of buying a company that's really in to the more high end work in customers' homes. But that came from a lot of focus and understanding of who they are and where the opportunities are. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think the one thing we can say is true in retail, but even more broadly, is that it's harder and harder to be a little bit of everything for everybody. Right. Because there either are very well-established players, in retail, it's easy to think about, Walmart or Costco, Amazon, that own that position. Carrefour, mentioned earlier, and the internet in general, from a marketplace standpoint, allows you to go out and just sort through vast quantities of a little bit of everything for everybody. But really, I think in terms of the space going forward, I mean, you can even look at one quick example that I've been looking into a little bit. If you even look at the hotel industry, if you go back 20 years ago, and I'm not talking about Airbnb in this case, I'm just talking about, more standard hotel models. It used to be you had several, local guys, but then you had several big brands, Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, running essentially the same concept for everybody. I'll invite people, if they haven't done it, to go to the Bonvoy website, which is Marriott Corp's portfolio of brands, or the Hyatt site, and see how many different formats they now have. It's 20 plus.
I'm always surprised. I'm staying at a hotel and you're like, you're part of that organization? I lose track.
Right, but they, the Marriott, and nothing against Marriott, stayed in plenty of them, or Hyatt stayed in plenty of them, but that kind of peak of the bell curve sort of format was fine. But, what they discovered, and I think, what consumer preferences revealed is, there's a great need for, same price point, but sort of hipper, upscale price point,
right,
and hip, that's the W, really luxurious, St. Regis, et cetera. So we've seen this micro segmenting, even though this is on a pretty big scale to really call it micro segmenting, but we've seen this more intense focus. So for a company like Marriott and Hyatt, they've achieved their focus by creating, or acquiring a dozen plus concepts over the last few years. Mm-hmm. So that's just a different version of it. That's not specifically a retail example.
You made me think of another example as you were talking about focus, because even back to our last episode with Kevin Tulip from Primark, I thought his answer around why they don't do e-commerce was particularly illustrative, and it's focus, right? It's like, as you said in the interview, your customers must be asking for it. How did he think about that? If anyone hasn't listened to that episode, it's a great exploration. But I think it's an exclamation point on your idea of the VUC so far, right? It's vision and focus.
Well, yeah. And the other thing I will add, when I do talk about this in the book a bit, but plenty of others have as well, as important as it is for figuring out who your brand is for, what's it for, and how you will become remarkable for them. It's also really important to say who it's not for. Mm-hmm, like it's okay. Like, I've had people say to me, hey, I've said to them, what do you think about this store? Or maybe I recommend a band to them or something. And they're like, I don't get it. And I'm like, okay, that's okay. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe it's not for you. Like, not everybody has to like everything. And I think it's often a good example of a really good brand strategy, particularly if you're not, one of these massive, mega brands, which, most people don't work at these massive mega brands, and you don't want to try to out Amazon. Right. It's probably,
you can't emulate them.
Right. But who is it, who is it for, but also who is it not for? Mm-hmm. Because if you're trying to please too many people, or like I said, kind of that peak of the bell curve, normal is for distributions, as some people say, then you may not be able to really carve out something that can be sustainable.
Right. Interesting. For a different discussion, but, paging back to our department store episode is, structurally, I'm trying to, please a lot of people across too many things. And maybe that's it's just very hard to stretch a concept along so many different segments. Let's talk about the last, ambiguity to agility. We've used the word agility many, many times. Many retailers have talked to me about the lessons learned from the COVID era, for example, that they just got to be more agile. Is that the final letter, so to speak, in VUCA? Is it the most important, or do you think these are all equally important? Is any one stand out to you more important than the others?
Well, if I had to pick one, I probably would pick the need to be. I mean, there's lots of things we need to do, right? We need to dig deeper. Yeah. We need to have resilience. We need to, do a bunch of things. But I think agility is really kind of the big takeaway, particularly from the last few years. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of ambiguity in outcomes. The ambiguity, like as we speak, are there going to be a lot more troubles in the banking industry? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Will interest rates be going up a lot over the next 6 months? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? I mean, it's
Will
not.
First Republic Bank survive? Maybe yes, maybe no.
Right. So, so I think, which is not to say that we shouldn't get input and develop a point of view, but it's probably more useful to be prepared to develop with a number of scenarios. Eventually you've got to, one of my favorite quotes, I think I probably mentioned it on the podcast, it's in the book, is from Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live. The show doesn't go on because it's ready. It goes on because it's 11:30. Yeah. So there clearly are deadlines and realities where we have to,
and minimal viable concepts. I mean, it's funny because that pushes against the completeness of the thought. In one way, is that, listen, we just got to get it out there and got to get it going. We got to get curbside stood up because the pandemic has shut down the stores. I mean, I think it fits in your overall framework, but speak to that, because I guess that's the emphasis on agility and taking risks. I mean, it all comes together. Yeah.
Well, I was being interviewed by somebody the other day, about the concept of agility and creating a culture of experimentation and those kinds of things. And I said, well, it depends on what the decision is. Going back to RH, if you're RH, at some point, the reality is you got to decide to get a piece of land, build this huge store, drop, I don't know what those stores cost, but, drop
lots,
tens of millions of dollars, right? I mean, there's not a, they may have tested elements of it, but, there's no way really to test that new concept without doing it. So that's one that's harder to kind of get into this, sprint model or, whatever. But there's lots of other things where there isn't this, 5 years of planning, kaboom, grand opening, and it works or it doesn't. So I think, we have to be mindful of what decisions we're talking about. But I would say in general, this idea of lots and lots of planning, lots and lots of study, and then, ta-da, here's my new thing.
Yeah.
That, which was really the model that I think you and I really grew up on. Yeah. At least the earlier parts of our career. So now I think it has to be much more dynamic. We have to build as much agility into the system as we realistically can. Lots of trade-offs involved with that, but certainly the general direction is to try to build more of that into your system. I think the other thing, and maybe I'll just kind of wrap up on this point, is one of the quotes that I often include in my keynotes and definitely have in the book is from this meditation teacher, Jon Kabat-Zinn. And, it's really in the context of kind of calming your mind, but I think it works pretty well in business as well, is that the waves are going to keep coming. So we have to learn how to surf. Like, just accept that the toing and froing of customer behavior, competitive, macro, whatever. I mean, these things are going to be out there. So we can't wish them away or just put our head in the sand, right? The action is to learn how to surf, to build that agility, and then bring as much knowledge, going back to some of the other letters in the VUCA framework, but bring as much strategy, knowledge, preparedness as we can to the table. And that's how we're best positioned to take advantage of what might unfold.
Let's wrap the episode with a question I sometimes ask in my interviews. Advice: 2 starts and 1 stop. Give some advice to the retailers and the folks listening, even though you're not retailers, you're thinking about innovation, you think about your company, maybe your own company. 2 things they should start doing right away, and 1 thing they should probably not do anymore or stop if they're doing it today.
Well, I think the major start would be around the focus and the clarity of who you're aiming to serve, both existing customers you want to serve better in a more remarkable way, but also those you are looking to acquire and grow in a meaningful way. Like, really getting clarity on that and understanding whether you're really doing enough to stand out from the competition, not just, this weekend with a hot deal, but, fundamentally.
Right.
The second one, I probably go back to something we touched on, which is to, in the words of the great retail strategist Kendrick Lamar, sit down, be humble. Just realize that we need to be more open to possibilities. We need to realize that we don't have all the answers. We're not in control of as much as we think. I think when you do that, a number of good things can happen. One is you're just open to more possibilities.
Right.
Secondly, I think maybe, you get a little bit more vulnerable and you ask for help. I mean, some of the mistakes that I made in my career was being unwilling, like, I'm the executive in charge. I'm supposed to have all the answers. And, to use an unfortunate reference perhaps, but, this idea that I alone can fix it, right? Like, it's a very, very narcissistic way of approaching things. So I think if we move more towards humility, it creates more possibilities, and we invite people in to solve what are often pretty challenging,
pretty gnarly
situations.
Problems. Yeah, gnarly. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the stop, I guess the stop that we should maybe end on is stop thinking about month-over-month sales results from the Wall Street Journal. Boom, boom. But what else can you add in terms of something you see retailers doing, and maybe or advice for them not to do, thinking of the context of VUCA and a dynamic world?
Well, I think it's more around stop attaching yourself, I guess, or leaning on kind of one size fits all or more monolithic strategies. Be much more open to the test and learn kind of philosophy fundamentally. But it's really all things that get in the way. Stop doing all the things that get in the way of deepening your understanding and creating that agility and giving you that clarity to really become more remarkable. There's probably a lot that fits under that broad heading.
Right. Well, that's a great way to leave this episode. Really a great theme and probably great advice. So let's leave it there. And once again, looking forward to seeing everybody in Vegas, baby. Let's leave it there, and everybody travel safe. If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Organized for Growth, our interview with Satish Mehatra, CEO of The Container Store. New episodes of Season 6 presented for another season by our friends at Volatile will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure and tell all your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at StephenPDennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker and producer, and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn, and you can catch up with Steve and I in person at Shop Talk in Vegas, March 26th, and a month later in Barcelona at the World Retail Congress, April 25th. Until then, safe travels, everyone.